Balance isn't something you think about when everything feels steady. It's easy to move forward when the ground feels solid, when nothing is shifting beneath you. But the moment things start to move, the moment life feels uncertain, that's when balance matters most. Every step becomes a decision, every movement a response. You adjust, you refocus, you try again. Because balance is about staying centered when what's beneath you is not. It takes focus, it takes trust, it takes letting go. Scripture reminds us, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make your path straight. So when life feels unsteady, fix your eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith. Let Him be your center point, and step by step, you'll find balance.
That when we think about balance and how things sort out, how things are clear, how things need to be seen. That really points us to the message this morning that we're going to be looking at here from Matthew 13. As I said, we typically always seem to address the familiar. And one might even say, well, why is that? Well, because a lot of times there are such profound things in the little things, and sometimes we miss that, because even like in life, sometimes we see these beautiful things, and sometimes we didn't see them the first time because we're so captured by everything else, or we're so distracted by everything else sometimes. And so I like readdressing these, because especially these are the teachings of Christ that we've been given. And I believe that everything that we've been given in that capacity is something to look deeper. What was the message there? So as this story begins, it reads that He is presenting another parable to them. And so we think about that, and what we find here is in just those words alone, presenting another parable, we find here, well, this is teaching time. This is lesson time. This is listen and learn time. Because one of the things that are unique about this type of story, this type of illustration, if you will, and my heart is really drawn to that these days, as I'm in a very reflective nature in life right now. Just personally, me, and I think sometimes we're looking for something. What's there? What's the lesson? What are we trying to find? And here, in these teachings from Jesus, the lessons are rich. They are deep. They are so much more profound than oftentimes they're allowed to be, because sometimes we just kind of skate over them, or maybe not look at the depth. And passages like this sometimes can be, oftentimes, just to be really frank, they can be taken out of context, or they can be used for something and set up measures for good and bad and right and wrong, and keep this and throw this out. But there's something more here. And I want us to take a look at that this morning. There's something more here. Because if we only see the surface, sometimes we miss the entire point. And that's true in life in general. Sometimes we see things happen. I'm going through, and this is just a personal thing that I'm doing. I'm working on my memoir, if you will, from my police career. I'm going through and I'm looking at all these stories from all those years ago. And it's been amazing how they've all come flooding back, and just the important things. But looking back at them from 30 years, now I see the story that's there. Now it wasn't just the call and the hysteria and all the stuff that was going. Now there's some amazing things there. What we find in these passages as we study is like, what is the lesson? And that's why we're calling this message today, It Will Eventually Show. Because oftentimes as we go through life, many of us have experienced this. You give things enough time, you'll eventually see what it is. Isn't that true? If you give it just enough time, eventually it will show itself. There's where we start here. We see a parable is being shared, an illustration, if you will, a story, a visual type of storytelling about something that those that are listening needed to hear, something they needed to think about or consider, something that maybe they wanted to know more about. Maybe they were at least curious about the manner and how this story is being told, and it's being done in a way so the listener can understand it better and have a clearer picture of the subject. I like that because I think that helps. And what we find here is it seems simple. Why? Because that's how Jesus taught. Simple. You know, he gave things that were basically object lessons, if you will. And here what we find is something that everybody would understand. In this case, it was farming. That just wasn't difficult to understand. You had a lot of people that grew crops, a lot of people that did things and raised farms and did all this other stuff. This was not a hard place to get someone to understand. And so it begins, the kingdom of heaven. Well, he says the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed seed in his field. Well, that sounds pretty simplistic, right? You're dealing with a bunch of people who know what farming is. They understand all that. But let's look at this, the kingdom of heaven. So he's not merely referencing a future destination or a divine promise of something better or a perfect place with angels and gold. No. Rather here, this is the content, the makeup, if you will, of how such is built. How does it get there? What is the components of that? How do we build that? We find something powerful in this parable. It's not about identifying or even removing. It's about growth. It's about how it eventually will reveal what is really there. How do we get there? How do we find that place? How do we get to that place? He says the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed. That's an action word, right? And what we find in that word is it is intentional. One who's gone out and sow. I'm doing this on purpose. I'm literally going out with this physical activity and I'm sharing this. I'm doing this with the intent of helping, with the intent of growing, with the intent of making something better. It says a man sowed, again, literal act of trying, good seed in his field. In other words, that was his plan. That was his intent. That is why I'm doing what I'm doing. I want to go out and sow the good seed. I want to sow the good news. I want to do all these things, all the things and the phrases that we come up with and all this other stuff. Here we find he's comparing that to a literal act in this farming concept. All right, so it says here that he did that. That's why he was doing what he was doing. I'm doing this for good. I'm doing this for help. I'm doing this for betterment. That's why we do what we do, right? As believers, we want to put the good word out there. We want to help people, show them life, hope, goodness, all these different things. And then we see the word but. Now, but, as we always point to, changes the conversation. It changes the narrative. It does everything. And it says, but. So this is the change moment in this scenario. While people were sleeping. Now, we can look at that as two different ways. We can look at it as literal. People were sleeping all night long. Or simply not paying attention. So I want you to think about the world that we're in today. No matter what's going on, there is so much happening around us today that creates division, that creates chaos, that creates disharmony. And oftentimes, friends, that's not done under the cover of night. Oftentimes, it is not done behind closed doors or when people have their eyes closed, but rather it's done while people are distracted and not paying attention. And sometimes it happens right in front of you, and you don't even see it because it's deceiving. It's masked over by something else. Maybe it appears to be one thing while it's actually something else. Is that true? You know, something can seem, man, that must be really good. Marketing is very deceptive in that way. Pictures of a certain meal or a certain product, man, that looks incredible. And then you order it and it comes in the mail. It's like, oh, that don't look like the same thing. Or you order it off the menu and they bring it to the table like, that's not quite what I was expecting. It happens, right? So again, we have it happening right in front of us. So the one who sowed good seed, we read that his enemy, Okay, now that is one who disagrees with him. That is one who desires to cause harm. But even greater, one who desires to cause confusion. Okay, in other words, I don't want you to know what's going on. I want to keep you in a state of chaos. I don't want you to realize the difference between these two things so that you never know. Or maybe you might pick the wrong one. Or we can go down a lot of different roads. And so we read that such this one, this enemy, if you will, also sows seeds. But rather than the additional good seed that has already been sown, no, we read here that he went out and planted weeds. Where's the problem? Where do we see what's going on? How does this story go? So we have good seed and we have weeds planted together in the same field. How does that become an issue? Well, let's look and see how this rolls out. Because at first, the difference is not clear. If you're walking down a row and you got a handful of seeds and you put those down, and a person walks on the road right next to you and they put seeds down too and they get covered up with dirt, who knows what? Maybe the one that put it there, but nobody else does. Because initially when it pops the ground, when it breaks the ground, green is green. What difference is it at that very moment? Where are we seeing the difference? And we wrestle with a lot of surface level stuff in the world today. We do. It's just there all the time. The right words, the right look, the right building, everything seems to be what I was thinking that it should be. Everything seems to be right. But time has a way of making the image clear. And that's just true. You know, back in the day, I remember, of course, you know, dating ourselves as we get a little older. How many of you remember when we had 3 channels and an antenna, and you were the remote? There's a few of us that way, you know, and Dad would want to see, you know, channel 4 or channel 2 or whatever it was, and, you know, so I'm outside with the window open, you know, and he's, all right, turn it a little bit more. It's almost clear. After a while, time would eventually clear up if the weather was okay, right? Sometimes time has a way of doing that. And here what we find is these 2 different types of seeds, if you will, have been planted, but in the initial stages, nobody could see what the difference was. Time would make that clear. Because you see, when we remove cosmetics, if you will, we begin to learn what's really behind it. You know, what the surface level is one thing. The paint, the makeup, whatever you want to call, all these different things can only hide things for so long. Something eventually comes out. What we learn in this parable is that as something grows, it becomes known by what it produces. In other words, the weeds aren't going to produce anything. The wheat will, right? And so we see that, and we find that in life all the different times when we begin to understand the difference between the two. The wheat and the weeds are, again, some versions, again, say tares, and again, they look very, very similar in infancy. But time makes it clear which is which. It does, every single time. When the plants, it tells us in verse 26, when the plants sprouted and produced grain, the weeds also appeared. Meaning that it was not clear that this is what they were until it grew. The difference between clear with maturity. Now here is where we begin to see the nature of this lesson. Here is where we begin to say, oh, wait a minute, now I'm starting to see what he was actually teaching here. Here's what is really going on. Maturity is a word that very much applies here. Very, very much. Because it's not oftentimes fully known until later. Okay? We see that all the time in character development within people. You know, you start off this way and then eventually it turns to this and on and so on. So we could have a million different illustrations, but it's not fully known until later. Some things can imitate appearances. They can. You ever watch those nature shows? You know, where like they got all these different kinds, especially fish and different things. They can camouflage themselves on the floor of the ocean, and nothing knows that it's just sand. And then, bam! When it swims over, it catches something. You know, I think there's another thing called I don't want to be wrong. I think it's a rockfish or something. But it can put itself in the sand, and you don't even know that it's sand until you step on it, and then you get really sick. And on so on. I mean, it's just always there. Everything has a way of masking over sometimes what it really is. It can be camouflage. It can be blending in to look like one thing. And then when the reveal happens, something changes. Someone gets hurt. Something gets whatever, and all these different things. But what we see in this lesson is while an early appearance seems to be the same, what gets produced later tells you what it really was. Do we see that in people? Do we see where we're going with this? How sometimes if we make a prediction or a identification too early, we may be making a mistake. Because not everybody's in the same place when we look at infancy and maturity and growing and all those different things. And this is the point that we're starting to make here. We see it within the confines of humanity. One person can act as if this way or that way. A person can act kind. A person can act, and that's the key word there, act kind if they see a benefit. Well, I can be nice for a little while until I need to show my real self. We see it all the time. I've seen it a million times throughout life. A person can do stuff and absolutely not mean it because eventually everything will be seen. And we can see this in every field of emotion, integrity, faith, religion. All of this can be performed. It's sad, but it can be. I've seen people stand on a platform like this and put on a flat show. And I knew who they were, and I knew they didn't mean one word that came out of their mouth. Okay? That's acting. It's performance-based. And I'm not saying that everything or everyone is that way, but we can see that it's real because what's going on underneath all the time, at some point in time, it will break through the surface. At some point in time, it will be exposed. It will come out. The lesson here that the Lord is trying to get us to see, the lesson that is being taught is so far beyond sometimes what it's been used for. Because oftentimes it's used for condemnation. Rather, what we find here is it's actually pointing us toward patience. How many of us in this room today struggle with patience? 100%. There's nobody here exempt from that, right? And it doesn't matter what it is. It could be traffic. It could be waiting in line somewhere. It could be all the different, waiting on someone to get something done that you asked them to do a week ago. It could be all these different scenarios, right? Patience is something we wrestle with here. Look at what happens, all right? So the servants, they find out that, hey, we got these two different items in this field, and one we believe shouldn't be there. And so, hey, we need to get rid of this, right? It's got to go. The servants, we read, they came to the one who sowed the good seed, and they said to him, didn't you did sow good seed out there, right? I mean, didn't you sow good seed in your field? In other words, isn't that true? That's what we heard. I mean, that's what we've come to understand. Isn't that true? I mean, you didn't by chance get something mixed up in there, right? I mean, you didn't let something else slip in, or you didn't call. I mean, we just want to make sure. We just want to make sure. Because what happened? Because if you only use good seed, where did the weeds come from? If you only used good seed, where did the weeds come from? In other words, how did that happen? We look around us all the time, and there's probably not a day goes by that we either say it or we think, how in the world did we get where we are? How did humanity get this way? How did things go on that's going on? How do we see the despair that is causing young people to take their lives? How are we seeing this and that and all this other stuff? We look around us and we say, how did that happen? How did that happen? And the answer most of the time is life happens. Things happen. But something gets infiltrated. Something comes in. And we find here on this occasion where there are times where indeed someone with the wrong intention tries to create an issue. But here's where the lesson in this parable, this illustration takes the turn. That's where we get stuck. Somebody did something. Okay. Do we get stuck there? Do we try to start getting bogged down in the fault finding or the instantaneous, there's the problem, let's get rid of it? Or do we take time to look? because sometimes we don't take time to look. And that's when times we make a bigger mess than there already is. Sometimes we got to take a little time. Those who see the thing that they determine is not the wheat, that it does not belong because it is not the same, they immediately want to remove it. It's got to go. And so they ask, do you want us to go and pull it out? Do you want us to go and get all that stuff out of it? Do you want us to go and get those things out there? Do you want us to go pull it up? And what did the sower say in the lesson? He said, no. No. What did he know that they didn't? What was he looking at that they didn't? What is the lesson here? What is Jesus trying to get us to see? Because we're not looking at wheat and weeds here, friends. We're looking at people. We're looking at the growth, because he said this is what the kingdom of heaven is like. What is it consisting of? What is going on here? The sower said no. Well, let's look at why. You see, they wanted to act quick. They wanted to act quick. That's what we do, right? I want to fix it right now. I ain't going to wait. Only to later say, oh, maybe I should have. This is not quite done. It's like taking something out of the oven early. You know, man, I'm hungry. I can't wait. And you take it out early, and then you bite into it like, oh, that chicken's still pink. I'm not big on raw chicken. You know, maybe somebody else is. That don't work for me. You know, we already know that cake is gooey in the middle, or any of these different things. The sower said no. Let's look at what he's trying to get us to see. They wanted to act quick. We found something wrong. We found something that's not the same. Let's get rid of it. Let's remove it. It's got to go. And now, on the surface, that seems rational. That doesn't belong here. It needs to be removed. I get it. It's a normal response. Most of us, in fact, I would say we even agree. But as with all lessons from Jesus, there's something deeper here. He's trying to get us to stop and look at the lesson. Listen to what it is that he's trying to teach. What is being said here? What is going on? There's more. Look at what the sower said. When you pull up the weeds, you might also uproot the wheat with them. Oh, wait a minute. I never really thought about that. You think about when you maybe you just cleared a little plot of land and you planted some things. You know, well, I know what I put down there, but man, there's another green thing here beside it. I don't know if I put that down there or not. Maybe I should pull that up. And then you end up pulling up. I've done that before, you know. And I pulled up the carrot that I planted instead of the dandelion or whatever. It happens, right? He's saying, hold on just a minute. Wait a second. I didn't realize it's not as simple as take this out and not consider the impact it might have on the rest. Sometimes we do that. Sometimes we get ahead of ourselves because we're so quick to want to uproot all the things that we determine don't need to be there, when in fact they may have a purpose. They may have a reason. Maybe they're just not ready. Maybe they haven't matured yet. What is he saying? Maybe I should let it all mature. And then I'll know for sure what is needed and what is not. Because then it's clear. Then there's not a doubt. Then there's no question. Then I don't have to look and like, well, I don't know, they both look the same. But if one's supposed to produce apples and one doesn't, you'll know. It'll be clear. There won't be any doubt. And so here what he's saying is, no. The sower said no. You see, those who had determined what was not wheat, they believed that it immediately needed to go. But the sower is telling them, he said, you haven't seen enough yet to determine that. You haven't seen enough yet to determine that. And I need you to hold on for just a moment until I show you what's really going on. You start to uproot everything, and you very well may damage the things that are good. You may make a bigger mess than what we already have. Hold on just a minute, because sometimes what we attempt to eliminate, because we think it's bad, we've determined that, again, it actually causes more damage than what we're trying to remove ever will. Really? Yeah. Because eventually it will show. eventually it will let us know. This impacts faith matters as well. How do we tie all this together? How do we make this a lesson? How does it become a part of what we believe and what we understand? It impacts faith matters, and it absolutely impacts church matters deeper than we could ever imagine. I'm telling you, friends, I mean, it's just after a long, long time of doing this, and there's some here that's obviously been around and done things a lot longer than I have, but how many times over the course of time, if you will, in a gathering, how many have been wounded? How many have been pulled up, if you will, because someone else decided they were a weed and they didn't need to be there? But they just weren't mature. They just weren't ready. They didn't recognize the difference in that infancy. I recall a young man many years ago, and he was being scolded one Sunday morning by another person in the church because he had sinned that morning because he wore a hat into the building. He never came back. He never came back. No matter how many times I tried to visit him, no matter how many times I tried to talk to him, no matter how many times I tried to comfort him, that was done. That was his first impression. That was over with. How many have been pushed away because someone else believed it was their job to belong, or their job to determine whether they belonged in the field or not? Sometimes we can't tell when it's just two green shoots sitting there. We just don't know necessarily which one is the right one. Here the Lord is saying, let them grow, and then you'll know. There won't be any question, because you'll see which one is going to produce something. You'll see which one is not. You'll see the difference between the two. Sometimes it is without question that we get so concerned. We get so concerned with finding wrong in everyone. We do. That's the world that we live in. Well, I know what they're doing. I know what they're doing. I know what they look like. And we just base it on surface level stuff. And we get so concerned about that we go and we start pulling up things before they're done growing. This is what the lesson here is about. Because look at what he said. This is the kingdom of heaven. This is how we grow it. This is how we get it stronger. This is how we get it filled with the components that will actually continue to build it. Because this is how we get there. But we got to make sure that what we put in there is the right thing. How are you going to know that until you wait until you know, right? And that's what he's trying to get us to understand. Sometimes things get pulled up before it stops growing. And that is why this lesson is so important. That is what this lesson is about. It's not about dividing wheat and weeds, if you will, but letting them both grow in order to make clear which one is which. And that's the beauty of this, because we can actually see how this actually works here. Because both grow, but the sower said, no, hold on just a minute. Let them grow together until the harvest. So again, we've got a line there. We've got a place there. We've got an understanding here until the harvest. In other words, time will reveal what argument can't. Well, I think it's this. Well, I think it's that. Well, how is either one of you going to know? It eventually will show. You'll eventually be able to tell. You'll eventually be able to understand, because it'll be clear, because there is a transition stage to where one now is beginning to look this way and clearly this one is not. So now we've got something different. We see that in lives all the time, but sometimes we get ahead of ourselves. Sometimes we don't let it take time to do that. In other words, time will reveal, as I said, what the argument cannot. If something is given time to grow, you will eventually know. You won't have to guess. It'll just be there. And you see it in nature, and you certainly can see it in people all the time. Eventually, character shows what that person really is. And again, we're not being, finger pointing and judging but it's true. I mean, I've been around it a long, long time. A lot of you have been around it for a long time. You eventually will see. A motive will show. Honesty or dishonesty will show. Goodness or evil will show. Hate or love will show. If you've ever been driving, maybe you've been on a country road or somewhere, and you've been driving and you've seen an actual wheat field, a real one. If there's something that is not wheat, you'll know it. It stands above it, actually. It's kind of waving and saying, hey, I'm not supposed to be here. You know, we see the differentials in the two things. They don't no longer blend. We had to arrest a guy years ago, and so he was covertly trying to grow marijuana. All right, this was back a long time ago when it was kind of a deal, and so he interspersed his marijuana within his okra plants. All right, so the okra is, all long and tall and green. Well, every other one or so, he would slip in a marijuana plant, so it would get all tall and bushy and green. Well, eventually, the marijuana began to stand out against the okra, and his of course, his answer when we came to harvest his new crop, he's like, I thought that was some strange looking okra, but he knew what was there, trust me. But in its infancy, not one person paid it attention. You could drive by it all day long and not really, because it's two green leafy things until one became a big leafy thing, without the little stalks on there, which okra is, well, yeah, that's a whole nother thing that you don't want to get into my dietary stuff because that is horrifying. But anyhow, that's a different story. What we find is in time, it will eventually show what's really there. And so if you've ever seen that real wheat field, you absolutely can see that. And once it's ready to harvest, you know which one is which. It is clear which one is the wheat and which one is not. Jesus, in this particular lesson, is trying to help us see the same thing in one another. Because there's a lot of people around us that aren't mature. And again, that's not a point of negativity or trying to cast anything on anybody, but there are a lot of people that are just getting started. I was just in Charlotte a couple weeks ago visiting a very, very dear friend of mine who's a staunch warrior for the Lord, maybe one of the greatest people I know in that particular case. And he was in a booth representing his particular cause, and there was someone else near to him, and he was talking about how he had been having a conversation with that person and how they were really rough around the edges, but he had gone over and was ministering to him and talking to him, and he had just found out the guy had just gotten saved like 2 days ago. So all the rust hadn't been knocked off yet. He wasn't cleaned up yet, but he wasn't ready to throw him out. He's like, man, I'll go over there ministering to him, talking to him. What we see here is what the Lord is trying to get us to see is the sower in this particular story says, I'm going to tell the reapers. Because there's going to be a time. There's a time that it comes to harvest. There's a time that it comes to be. He says, I'm going to tell the reapers. In other words, the ones who gather, to gather the weeds first. Think about that for a minute. Think about that. How? Why? Why now? Why at harvest time? Because now it's clear. Now I know what does not belong in the crop. Now I know what's not going to be a part of the kingdom of heaven. This is not the part that fits in. This is not the part that works. See, cosmetics only last so long. We know that. Cosmetics only last so long. No matter what they're trying to cover up, it's eventually going to come out. It doesn't matter. It could be paint over rust. It could be something over an ugly attitude. It could be something over something that's unpleasant to look at. It could be rot. You can only paint a rotten board so long. Eventually, you're going to know that it's not good, right? There's just so many different things that it can cover, and it only does it for so long. You can only polish things for so long until you eventually find out what is really there. What we find in this story is Jesus is more interested, and I think this is true. Jesus is more interested in what's in the package rather than the wrapper. Think about that. Because sometimes, I remember my mother used to do this when we were kids. She would wrap stuff in strange things. You'd get a gift, but it would be in a Little Debbie's box, or it would be, in a box this big with 50 boxes inside of it till you got to the gift. It was about this big. She was notorious about that growing up because you never knew. She would never want you to know what was in it. Sometimes that's true. But here what we find is Jesus is saying, okay, so we're arguing over the two little green stems that just popped up, and neither one of you know which one is which. Let them grow and you'll find out. Okay? We see that. And so what we're finding is he's looking at the long-term plan here, which we sometimes get impatient with, because I want to know now. I want the answer right now. Sometimes we're not going to get that. Sometimes it's going to take a while. You know, I've been with people throughout this ministry all these years. I remember a lady asking me every Sunday, just like we do here on Wednesday night when we take prayer requests and how can we pray for somebody. And this lady said, I've been praying. She said, I just want you to know you've been praying for my friend. And I've been praying for them for over 40 years. And she said, I just want you to know that the other night they called me and they finally gave their life to the Lord. They just weren't ready. They had not grown there. They hadn't got there yet. But what if that weed had been picked out and thrown away? You're no good. You'll never make it. It happens all the time. He's trying to get us to recognize something important here. What we find in this story is Jesus is pointing us to something that he already said earlier in Matthew 7:16. You will recognize them by their fruit. In other words, you'll know. There won't be any doubts. There just won't be any doubts. I got 2 peach trees planted in my yard. I know what they are. You know, I know what the label was on the paper when I put it in the ground. Now, next year, if they harvest and it comes out apples, then somebody lied. But that's what it's supposed to be on there, right? But when it produces its first fruit, then somebody will know, whether it's me or the new homeowner. Either one, somebody's going to know, right? That's what he's telling us here. When you can decorate the plant, you can put all kinds of different stuff on it, but you can't change what it produces. And that's true. And that's what he's trying to get us to understand. It's not about the surface, it's what's really in here. It will eventually show. The sower tells the reapers, gather the weeds and do that first. Get them out of the way so they're not in the way of the harvest that's coming. We don't want that to be any kind of impediment. Get that out of the way. Gather them first, tie them in bundles, and burn them. Remove them at harvest time because now it's clear. Gather and get it together, bundle it up, and don't just remove it, but burn it up. Keep it away. Get rid of it. Get rid of the harm it still poses. Get rid of that. Get it out of the way because if it's allowed to leave a trace or a seed, it will. And it'll come right back. He's saying, let's get rid of that. Let's not have that as part of what we're doing because now we know what it is. See, that's the problem sometimes today is once something has been exposed and it's learned what it is, then it's ignored. Oh, well, it wouldn't really do that. Yes, it will. You know, once you know that the dog will bite you, every time you go try to pet it again, that's on you. That's just true, right? Because you already know now what the demeanor is. You can't mask over that. That's been revealed. This is what he's trying to say. This has been removed. Let's get rid of that. And at the end, he says, gather and burn the weeds. All right? But where's the difference? Look at how it ends. And at the end, he says, but collect. That's important, friends. Let's read that together. All right, this last part of the verse. He said, at harvest time, I'll tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and tie them in bundles and burn them, but collect the wheat in my barns. What do? We keep things we collect. We keep things that we treasure. We keep things that we want to hold on to. We keep something valuable. We keep something personal. We collect those things. He says, collect the wheat in my barn. In other words, I want to keep that. That means something. What did he say? This is like the kingdom of heaven. That's what he's talking about. He's pointing to mine. I want to keep that. I don't want all the stuff that don't belong. I want you. But wait until we know what is what. We keep something, we collect stuff that we like, that we want, that we desire. He says, I want to keep that because that is what I sowed. That is the real thing. Is not corrupted. So we look around and we quickly determine the weeds and the wheat by the surface level exam. But Jesus says, no, hold on. Don't do that. Let them finish growing before you get ahead of yourself. Because see, we all know that pointing the finger is easy. It is. That's the world that we live in. Right, wrong, or indifferent. Everything that we see on the surface, we make a determination about, right? And we're all guilty. I include myself. I've been guilty, and I sometimes struggle with it. Clothes. Oh, well, I know where they come from. Hair. I know what kind of person they are. Language. Whew, well, it's a rough fellow there, man. Listen to the way he talks. It's an easy thing to do to spot the weeds, or we think so. It's very, very easy to do that, or we think so. And we can be conditioned to think so. Think about when Jesus appeared and they said, what good could ever come out of Nazareth? That was already determined because of the geographic location. Nothing good could ever come from there. I've heard that said today in 2026 about different geographical places around the world. Nothing good ever comes out of that place. Nobody good ever comes out of that place. Is that true? It's easy to determine what we've been conditioned to think when it comes to the weeds. But here's what I want to end. I want us to think about this. What about me? What does my life produce? Think about that for a minute. What does my life produce? Is it collectible? Is it collectible to be placed in the barn and keep? Or should it be gathered up and burned? I mean, again, we think about that. That sounds rough. Think about it for a minute, friends. What grows where I sow? That's the thing that we have to think about. What grows where I sow? Here's the bottom line. Appearances are misleading. You don't believe that? I mean, maybe there's no single people here. Do online dating. You know, the profile picture and the one that walks through the door might not be the same. I've heard horror stories about that and known people who've gone down that road. But here's the thing. Sometimes appearances are misleading. Sometimes you don't always know at first. I've met people like that to where, you know, you walk in like, man, I don't know if I could even talk to that person. Well, they just look mean. And then sometimes might end up being your best friend, you know, because you just took time to get to know him. There was a man that died a couple of years ago that I had gotten to know, and he had a really rough reputation. There's no question about that. And when he passed away, a lot of people, especially on social media, which it's always easy to be the armchair keyboardist when somebody does something they can't defend themselves. They had a lot of negative things to say about this man. And it resurfaced the other day because it's like the 5th anniversary of his death. And somebody says, what do you think of this guy? And it just so happened I happened to see it. And I just put on there, he was always really good to me. It kind of quelched all the negativity. Because people, you know, it's easy to say this or that about somebody. But here, it's easy to look at appearances and they're misleading. And sometimes you don't know. We have to be careful. We have to be careful with the attempt to label everything. We really do, friends. We got to be careful with the attempt to label or expose everything, because sometimes allowing the weed to grow is beneficial. Sometimes pulling it is actually harmful. Balance. It's hard to find. Patience. It's hard to find. But what we find in this is exactly pointing us to that. Take time. Give it time, because it will be seen. It will eventually show what is really there. The fruit will always identify the tree. There will never be a question if it's an apple hanging off that bush or a pear or a peach or a cherry, whatever. It will always identify the tree. Stop inspecting somebody else's field and see what you produce when you sow. Our life, it's not about proving what or who everyone else is. That's the world, and we get too bogged down in that. We do. We look at that stuff all the time, but that is what he's trying to tell us here. Don't do that. Don't do that. Our life as a follower of Christ should be about growing. It should be about loving and doing what the examples that we were given from Christ really are, which ultimately proves us to providing and producing something worth collecting in his barn. That's what we need to be looking at. So as we wrap up today, don't worry about being a weed puller. Working on being a wheat grower instead. Amen? All right. We have this last song, and we think about these words. And again, oftentimes, you know, as I oftentimes say, I'm talking to myself as much as I am anybody else, because we're all in this journey together, friends. None of us have made it. We've been talking about on Wednesday nights, we're going through the book of Philippians, and Paul says, you know, everybody had revered him and everybody had really placed him. He says, I ain't got there yet. I'm working on it, but I haven't made it yet. You know, I'm far from perfect and far from here and there. And sometimes that's true, and we need a reminder of that regardless of positions we hold, titles we have, pedestals we're on, any of that stuff, nobody's exempt from anything. We haven't got there yet. But if we continue to keep working on it, it's just like watching those two green things grow. Eventually you'll know which one is the seedling that you put down to grow something and the other one is not. And you know that. And that makes it clear. That's all the Lord is trying to talk about. When we look at one another, some people are still growing. Some people never will. But you'll see as time goes by. Let's look at this song. Stand if you will, sit if you will. That's entirely up to you how you want to worship. But these words speak to your heart.